Awesome. So welcome. And I am Julie Burt. I'm the coordinator of the campus writing program. I often handle a lot of the writing intensive course proposals. So if you're involved with writing intensive, you'll probably get a lot of emails from me and from our group related to your course proposal. Today we're also joined by Amy. Amy, if you can give a wave, the director of our program. And Christy's here too, our associate, right? Associate director. And then Im Stagg, who's our fabulous program manager, who you probably also receive a ridiculous amount of emails and calendar invites from. So if you feel free to message us if you have any questions or anything that we can help you with related to teaching with writing. So today you're here for one of our final fall workshops. We are still in the process of planning for spring, so look for that on our website and through our email listserv. If you're not on that listserv, feel free to direct message Im Stagg, who's here, and she will make sure that you get added to our list of emails. Or if you have any ideas, feel free to message Amy, Christy, or I, and we can coordinate a workshop related to the things that you guys are struggling with in your writing classes. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Sarah Apple, who is wonderfully agreed to join us. You can go ahead and click through one, Sarah. Okay. Or two, one more.
Yep.
Yeah. Who is she said coming up on 20th year of teaching in the science classroom.
This is it.
This is it. Oh, so this is your 20th year.
In 20th year.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And was involved with the STEM Literacy Project, which is how she found her way to us and the National Writing Project. So we welcome her to talk to us today about culturally responsive teaching.
Thank you. And yeah, this is very informal. My teaching style in the classroom is very interactive, so please feel free. I will build in sometimes for us to interact, but also feel free at any time if you have questions or anything. And of course, you can put those in the chat, and I assume somebody will be kind of helping me monitor the chat while I go through it. So the desired outcomes for this session, we want to define culture so that we have a shared common vocabulary to make sure we're talking about the same thing, explore the benefits of culturally responsive teaching, a shared analysis and concepts for examining equity and inclusion in our classrooms, and then strategies for teaching culturally responsive writing skills specifically. So we'll start with culture and critically responsive teaching, the other CRT, the one that you're not hearing that often. So this is how I start all of my classes. So let's take a couple minutes and write. We have a prompt here about culture. So when you hear the word culture, what comes to mind for you? How would you describe your own cultural background? How does culture impact learning in the classroom? And anything else that comes to mind during the 2 minutes? And I'll set the timer. All right. So if anybody would like to share anything that came to mind for them in the chat, or you could unmute and speak and share. I can start off by saying that something that came to mind, and this will be for you biology people out there, I guess if you're a biology person, but one of the things that came to mind for me is the concept of a niche in biology, because it is all encompassing, like it includes so many things all with under this umbrella of this one word, and it can be kind of difficult to define because of that. And I kind of feel like culture is the same way.
You know, Sarah, that was what hit me too, because I started listing all the things that I see that make up culture, you know, so yeah, language, time, place, family, background, blah, blah, blah. And then I thought, you know, it is almost like it's created a fabric that just we aren't going to get rid of, and it's going to change, it's going to be flexible, but it's always there. And it's always made up of so many different threads weaved together.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a little bit about my own culture and thinking about the classrooms that I've taught in from my time teaching high school and here at Mizzou as well, and the fact that they're predominantly white spaces. And so the culture is kind of invisible because it's the dominant culture, and we often maybe take that for granted and in thinking about what, you know, what other voices we're including. So I thought a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be a whole separate workshop because that is a very big topic. Yeah. Yeah, good. So this is a great model, I think, of culture using an iceberg. And oftentimes the things that come to mind for us first are surface culture type of things. The goal here is to move beyond heroes and holidays, though, because I feel like that's what we focus on a lot when it comes to the classroom culture. It's like, oh, what can we celebrate this month? What is this month's celebration? But when we talk about culturally responsive teaching, that's not what we're talking about. We're diving deeper into unspoken rules, unconscious rules. The backgrounds that we all come from is different, and that includes, you know, even things like eye contact, body language, you know, how we approach learning in the classroom can be different culturally. And so we want to be open to different ways of learning and learn more about that. This is a great model using a tree. One of my favorite things to model with is trees. And so again, we start with that surface level. There's not much emotional charge there with the surface level changes. It is nice to celebrate food, music, dress, holidays, etc. But when we're looking at learning, we really want to have some impact. And if you look at this model, you'll notice that the mental models and our funds of knowledge are in that deep culture, which also has the most emotional charge associated with it. So that's kind of interesting. So what is culturally responsive teaching then, and why is it important? So what we find if we're not taking a culturally responsive approach in the classroom is that we'll hit things like language barriers when we're dealing with a diverse classroom in terms of understanding, comprehension, participation. We can see the impacts of systemic discrimination, which impacts students' comfort and safety in the classroom, and then lack of representation as well. So the bias that can show up in curriculum and in testing, because like Christy said, it is predominantly white historically. And so that's a lot of where we're teaching from. And so if you don't come from that background, then it can be a very different experience for you. So what does CRT look like? First and foremost, we want a safe and inviting place of learning where mistakes are allowed. We call that productive struggle. For my students in my classroom, a lot of times when they're complaining that something is hard or they're really struggling, I'm like, wonderful, it's great. They look at me like I'm crazy, but that's part of the process. That means we're doing something good here if we're struggling. Having a student-centered learning environment, we want to encourage that critical thinking. That brings in, of course, we have to support that critical thinking, scaffold that critical thinking, but we want to make sure that that's taking place for all students. A place with high expectations of rigor and relevance for all. I don't know about the higher education level, but boy, secondary high school and school districts, they love talking about rigor and relevance, but I don't feel like we spend a lot of time talking about what does that look like and how do we make sure that's happening. And then finally, a place where culture, race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, and any of these other multitude of identity markers are valued. And I think the key there is valued. Oftentimes, you know, we talk about having diversity within our classrooms, and sometimes there's a deficit mindset to that, right? Like, oh, if I have students who don't speak English, this concern of how am I going to teach them in the exact same way I'm teaching everybody else, as opposed to an asset mindset. How can we benefit from this diversity and from the varying languages and cultures that are in the classroom? And so that brings us to culture, equity, and inclusion in STEAM. I keep putting the A in there, so I know that we're used to STEM, but I really want to emphasize the A today. And so I'll kind of alter that here and there. So, this one, nope. Okay, so you've probably all seen a similar graphic where you've got people standing on different boxes, maybe trying to look at a baseball game or something like this. This one is specific, of course, to education. So I think that there has historically definitely been this idea that we need to make sure everyone is getting the exact same resources, but the world is not equal, and that does not guarantee equal outcome. And what we're really wanting to achieve is an equal outcome. And so we can see this graphic here where certain students are more likely to have scholarships and educated parents. They can afford tutors to get better scores on the ACT and the SAT. They have more honors courses, AP credits. This is something I'm running into in the district I'm in right now. We're having a situation where we have fewer and fewer students who are interested in taking some of these higher level courses like AP classes and dual credit classes. And so then because of the numbers game, you know, these classes aren't making. And then that creates a huge equity issue for the students who do want to take those courses in our district. There's some discussion, in fact, of getting rid of physics, because there aren't enough students enrolled. And so how does a student who wants to be an engineer in my school district make sure that they're receiving the education that they need? And so it is an issue. Very quickly, I just like to include this because I feel like there's a lot of talk about diversity, but diversity isn't something you're doing. That's just what comes to you, right? So like I work in a very diverse district. About 75% of my district is students of color, but we didn't do anything to achieve that. That's who's coming to our schools. And so what we want to look at is the equity and the inclusion piece of that. How are we making sure that our policy, our practices are equitable, that we are including those same kinds of voices in the groups that matter, and that includes both amongst the students, but also the teachers and admin. All right, so here we have our science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. And the arts is where we really want to emphasize this whole culture and literacy component. So we want to use arts as an anchor within our instruction, and that will include the writing that we're going to be talking about today. So what challenges do you think educators face, or do you specifically face when it comes to incorporating things like that into your classroom? When we say, hey, we're going to put arts and culture and literacy into our classrooms, what are the concerns? What are the obstacles? Again, you can put it in the chat or share.
My first thought, Sarah, is there's just so much content I have to cover. I just don't have time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep, time is pretty much the big one. They may have anything besides the time. And so my big answer to that, we have a whole kind of cultural competency push within our district that we're working on, and that's what we hear a lot of. I just don't know how I have time for one more thing. How do I add anything else to my plate? And the answer that I try and provide as many examples as I can is, it's not that we want to add anything else. The content is the content. We just want to teach the content in a different way. Same content, different approach. We want to view everything that we do through an equity lens. And so it's not that we're adding anything, it's that we're just viewing it differently and approaching it differently. And so that is the goal. Yes. So in terms of equity and STEM instruction, I think that this is a nice graphic. The top row are the systems that we want to interrogate. So as we do look at our classrooms and at our curriculum, this is the level, kind of the thinking component, things that we need to think about. Starting on the far left, the math and science canon. What is the curriculum that we're teaching and why? We want to investigate that, right? Like, why is this the curriculum that I'm expected to teach? And again, we can go back into that historically white approach. Why do we start physics with Newton? There's actually a lot of physics from indigenous peoples long before Newton. So why start with Newton? Structures of privilege, exploring why math professors are mostly white men. Our own personal biases and identities, and of course, those that all students are bringing in as well. We are all human beings. I did once have a parent look straight at me and say about their daughter, well, she's a girl, she's not going to be good at science. To me, also a girl, who's, not to brag, but pretty good at science. So very odd. And then, of course, our STEM teaching methods. What do we want our students to do in order to learn? And then that lower level is more the doing components. This is where we actually take some actions in our classroom. Explicitly studying STEM history to include maybe not Newton, maybe somebody else. Why Newton? You know, what other contributions can get us to that same information? Discussing modern day STEM inequities as they relate to our content and our curriculum. Again, not adding it on, but how does our curriculum connect to things where we could have some pretty important real world discussions? Building student STEM identities, that one is huge. And I feel like that's almost one of the easiest ones to tackle, is just to make sure that representation piece is there. And then finally, teaching responsibly. And that's where we're going to explore some strategies today. And so what we want to be thinking about then is what types of background knowledge are most valued traditionally, historically, etc. And then how do we activate the background knowledge of our students in a more equitable way? And so that brings us to these culturally responsive writing tips. There is a link here. Maybe somebody could put it in the chat if anybody's interested, to the NCTE's Understanding and Teaching Writing guiding principles. I just highlighted the few that I thought would best relate to what it is we're talking about today. And part of that is that everyone is a writer. And so, you know, I have a lot of students who come in and say, you know, oh, I can't do this and I can't do that. And so trying to break students of that mindset. Everybody can write. That's partially why we do the 2-minute free write in my class every single day. We are writing. Writers bring multi-literacies and they bring cultural and linguistic assets to whatever they do. Again, that asset focus. And then finally, writers grow when they have a range of writing experiences and in-depth writing experiences. So just really looking for opportunities to embed that writing. Somebody have any thoughts on that? Additions, things maybe that I should have included from their list? Or does that look like a good selection?
I like this, and I think I would add that everyone is a writer and can become a disciplinary writer, right? I think that is the challenge. Like, some of our students in our WI classes think that they are decent writers in other realms, but not in the chemistry classroom or not in veterinary world. And so making that part of their becoming in sort of like a really transparent way is important to me, I think.
I agree, and I can relate to that completely. I am very much a technical writer as a science person, and so I can write a technical paper like nobody's business. When it comes to the creative writing, and I think I am my worst enemy. I'm just very self-conscious about it. It's not that I can't do it. It's just I'm really hard on myself and I'm self-conscious and it just doesn't feel comfortable. It doesn't come natural. And so in my class, I do emphasize the difference between the two. And I try and let my students know which one we're doing at any given time. You know, this is technical writing. And so one of the things I have my students do regularly in my class is we'll write a summary. And I want that to be technical. This is a technical summary, just the facts, stick to the facts of the text. And then I will separately have them write a reflection. And that I want to hear their voice. That can be as creative as you want. That's where I want to see the connections. And so I do try and model both for my students, because it is important for science kids to be able to do the technical piece. And they really do struggle with that. And so I spend a lot of time looking at, you know, a summary and saying, okay, this would go in your reflection, because this is not fact, this is opinion, this is reaction. Let's put that over here in the reflection piece. So I think that is a very good point, that the writing can look different. Any other thoughts?
I really like that idea, Sarah, of modeling for the students, because just trying to teach that technical writing so much that if I ask them to write a letter, they're like, I don't know how to write a letter. So anytime we can model for them. And I love that you're explaining to them if you explain to them your self-consciousness, hopefully they'll be a little more
Oh, I do.
willing to
And
share.
yes, and I completely gas them up all the time because I do have such creative kids in the classroom. And so I really kind of gas them up with their creativity, like, oh my gosh, you're so talented. I love how you can bring that creativity into that piece. Because I truly am, it is something that doesn't come easy to me. And I think it's important for them to see that we all struggle at things. I just had this conversation with my students yesterday about how this kind of new societal expectation that every kid gets straight A's, to me, it's just a little wild. Like, you're saying that you should be advanced at every single thing that you do. That's a pretty big bar that we're putting on kids. And I see the stress that it creates. So we all have our strengths. I do believe that we can all improve. I often use the example, you can't see me right now, everybody, but I'm like 5'1". And so I oftentimes use the example of basketball. Does it come naturally to me? No. Am I a super sporty person? No. Could I get better at it with the right coaching and practice? Yeah, absolutely. I could get better at it. Probably not going to be in the NBA, but I can grow. I can get better. I can shoot some hoops. All right, so that brings us to these culturally responsive writing tips. And they are 5 C's, which hopefully make them easy to remember. So the first one is consistency. And I feel like this is hopefully one of the easier ones. Just write, write every day. Make sure that we frequently are building in opportunities for students to write, because I think that takes some of the fear out of it. So as I said, I start every single one of my classes with a 2-minute free write. I do try and come up with questions or prompts that lead into the day to also prime the learning. So again, I'm doing 2 things at the same time. Yes, we're writing, but I am also, tying it into the curriculum and what it is that we're going to be learning that day. I've included some kind of sentence stem ideas here of just quick little writes that you could build in at the beginning of the class, at the end of the class, maybe in the middle if you feel like everybody just needs a break for a moment to process what you've got already before you move on. So even building in a couple of 2-minute breaks here and there to like, hey, let's take a minute and write about what we've gotten out of this so far, what questions we have, could be useful. Any thoughts on that one? Is this something that you think would work in your classrooms?
And no, I'm going to ask the question, Sarah. Do you read them? Do you grade them? Do you give
Oh,
points?
yes. So for me, and again, I teach high school science. So what I do is I set the timer just like we did. And then when the timer's up, I do give them time to talk. And again, that's to build some confidence, kind of a think, pair, share before we do have the discussion as a group. But while they're as tables having their conversations, I go student by student and I stamp their paper. I have a little Apple stamp because I'm precious like that. So I go and I stamp their papers, and I luckily I'm a very quick reader. So I'm not like slowly reading it, but I am quickly scanning, trying to give any feedback or comments that I can so that they know that I'm seeing it. Sometimes they write things that make me laugh. They always get a kick out of that. Sometimes, of course, we're also modeling or diagramming. And so we try and have some fun with it. But yeah, I try and touch base with every single kid every day. And this is the way that I do it, is through my 2-minute free write. Yeah. So I don't collect them. No, because that would just be too much. So I do it right then in the moment. I do a quick scan, and I know that's going to depend on the classes you're teaching, the class size, the class setup, those sorts of things at the university level, but it works for me for sure. Other thoughts or questions? All right. The next C is on communication. And so we want to share examples of professional content area writing. That's again something that I work on a lot with my students, is showing them what actual science writing is. We do spend a lot of time evaluating what is a relevant source, what is a scientific source. Y'all, they started this year, I had asked for a source and a claim evidence reasoning, and they were all putting Google, and it was filling me with a rage that I just can't. And so we had a big long conversation about how if I asked to come to dinner at your house tonight and I asked for your address and you told me the United States of America, I'm not going to be there on time. Like I need more. That's a search engine. It's not a source. And so we've been working on identifying sources, what are reputable sources, but we want to provide them examples because again, you have to show them. So showing them examples of, this is a scientific source. How can we tell it's a scientific source?
That discussion is one that I just had with a faculty member here yesterday about source citing. So I love this suggestion to get past, like, it's from the library's website or it's from Google. Like, that is not enough.
No. And we even have, this is something unique to my district, but we have this program called Actively Learn. And one of the things that I have my students doing right now, we're doing a research project in biology. And what I have them doing right now is when they find a source, I want them, they can upload it to this, it's I don't know, it's a program that we use, and we use it to assign reading and questioning and things like that. But there's a research project tab where they can link URLs from the sites that they find, and it does citations for them. You can choose APA, you can choose MLA. So, you know, you're not even having to create it, but I think even them seeing that's what a citation looks like. I'm not asking you to create it from scratch, but I am going to ask you to copy and paste it and put it into your project when you create your bibliography so that you know that's what a source is. It's not google.com. Yeah. So one thing we do want to do here when we are selecting our text is to make sure that we are applying that equity framework. Why am I selecting this text? Who wrote this text? Whose voice is in this text? Whose voice is not in this text? Pulling from a variety of authors and backgrounds, because that representation really does matter. And so that is something that I'm constantly doing. Even when I communicate with my slides, when I go to add graphics and pictures, I try to make sure that the graphics and pictures of human beings that I choose match the students that are in my classroom. And again, that's a thing where if you Google pictures, you're going to see a lot of pictures of white people before, or of course, the brochure ready token person of color in the group. You know, it's like to try and find some authentic imagery of just real people of color to include within slides when we're talking about different subjects. That's something I make an effort to make sure that that's represented. And then the big one, and Christy, you'll love this, storify it. And so this one is for real. So I know somebody had mentioned about kind of the science of writing. I can't tell you too much about the science of writing, but I can tell you the science of the brain and communication and what works. And so let me see if I can hold this up here. So one book is Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. She goes into a lot of detail about how we learn in terms of the brain and neural pathways, and explores that in a culturally responsive way. So I would recommend that book. And one of her top recommendations, her 3 top recommendations are, you want to gamify things. So playing games, that works across cultures. Another one is social, which we'll get to in a minute. And then the third one is storify it. She wants you to incorporate stories. And another great book on that one is this one here. It's called Story Proof: The Science Behind the Startling Power of Story. And this all gets into how our brains work and why we remember things when they come to us in the format of a story. And so this again is same curriculum, same content, but how can we tell it in a story so that kids are more engaged, more likely to remember it? And so that's a big one. And there's a couple of ways I weave this in. I've also noticed that when I'm teaching, it's when I go off script and start telling stories that I have their attention. If I'm teaching them what's on the slide, they're like, The minute I'm off, I was even doing it today, the moment I start going, oh, but actually, and I start telling a story, way more attention, way more engagement, and they remember that stuff. They'll come back to me later and they remember all the details of that story that I told them. And so that again is going to cross cultural barriers and giving your students those opportunities to tell their stories.
Sarah, I love that. I've been using my own home chickens and a lot of the stories, and my children. And they ask me all the time, so how is that turkey doing, or that chicken you were talking about the other day? So, and yeah, otherwise they're just, moving their chair up and down.
Yeah.
That's right. So they seem to be really engaged when I go, like you said, off script and just like, oh yeah, this relates to the chickens we've been breeding at my house. Like, I appreciate it. Thank you for justifying the fact that I spend too much time talking about my own kids and chickens.
No, and that's the relationship building piece. They want to learn from people that they feel like they know. We all do. Like if you know somebody, you're much more likely to listen to them and be interested in what they have to say if you know them and like them. And so relationship building is huge. And so now granted, there are students who know how to get me off task really quick. I fall for it every time. Oh, Ms. Apple just asked me this question and then I'm off on this tangent. But those are really important moments. And those are the moments where we really bond with our students. And that's what's going to make the learning special and memorable and engaging for them. So absolutely. The next C is collaboration. And so again, that's one of the things mentioned by Zaretta Hammond in this book, that we want to give kids those opportunities to work together. And so focusing on cooperative learning, whether that's letting them work together to compose essays, reports, blogs, stories, poetry, cartoons, reflections, analyses, opinion pieces, asking students to take part in developing whatever scoring guide you're going to use so that they have some ownership in that. Also, I think you're less likely to hear what scoring guide, which is what I get all the time if I simply provide one. I just get stuff that I went over it with you, I attached it to the assignment, I printed it off for you, what scoring guide? And so having them take part in the creation of that, I think would also be more memorable and will help us with our own blind spots when it comes to different cultural backgrounds. Like, I come from one cultural background, maybe as I'm creating the scoring guide, there's things I'm not thinking about that will come up within that classroom conversation and will make a better scoring guide. Critical thinking, of course, we want to connect that content to real life. And again, this is to me where some of that storytelling again comes in when we're connecting it to real life. Inviting students to write and talk about their own personal experiences, relating content to their lives. That's something I ask about all the time. What connections can you make to this? What personal connection can you make to this content? Or, how does this relate to something you've experienced in your life? And hearing those different stories from kids, I think is a very valuable experience. The other big one, giving them opportunities to write for an authentic audience and purpose, giving them real problems to solve. The one that we're working on in my biology class right now, we're doing a research project. Now, here's my content. My content is we just did biochemistry. Now we're starting ecology with photosynthesis and cellular respiration, metabolism, basically, and we're going to be doing ecology stuff. But the question I posed to them in kind of a design thinking style is, I taught them about centenarians, people who can live to 100 and over. We looked at where that's most likely to happen. And right now we're doing research. My challenge to them is I want all of them to live to 100. And so how are you going to do it? And so they're doing research on what is contributing. Now, genetics, we can't really do anything about. So we talk about that. You have to put that one aside. But what other lifestyle factors? So we're doing longevity right now, but we're also going to then hit the happiness piece, because I don't want you living 100 miserable years. I want you happy the whole time. So then we're going to do a whole mental health component as well. We're going to talk about how that mental health impacts that. And so we're bringing in diet, we're bringing in food, we're bringing in exercise, and we're going to be tying it to the content. But to me, I think that's something that's really going to help kids. I don't know that they really need to know that much about photosynthesis if they're not going to go into something specific to that. But do they need to know how to live a long and healthy life? I sure hope so. So that's an example of something we're doing in my class. And I just kind of tack it on a little bit. We just chunk it a little bit each time. So like right now, we're just kind of in the research phase as we have extra time. Put your research and actively learn, and then we're going to move on from there. And then finally, creativity, allowing choice, give an overall topic, and then let the students have some choice in what they're going to research or how they're going to frame that, what they're going to create, what's the product. I tend to provide my students with options because otherwise they're lost little puppies. I have no idea what to do. So I do tend to provide options, but my last option is always or something else. If you have a better idea, come and talk to me. I'm always open to that, but I do try and provide them. I had them writing a little poem. We did do a Hispanic Heritage Frida Kahlo focus last Friday, and I had them doing some digital self-portraits, and I had them include a little bio poem component. And I had some kids who wanted to go off script, and I'm like, yes, please. I don't want to give you a step-by-step here, please complete this to create this poem. But with my students, if I don't provide some sort of structure, a lot of them are lost. And so it's kind of like, here's a structure, but please don't feel connected, tied to that. Break free. And I even had one yesterday who was showing me little poems he was writing. And he said, I think I'm actually really good at this. He goes, I think I could be a good poem writer. And I said, a poet? I said, you might be able to. I said, just keep doing it and see where it leads. And so pretty neat.
I love that, Sarah. So among like your choices in creativity, I find that if I give them like, write a paper or do a PowerPoint or something, they'll all pick the same thing.
Mm.
They're so comfortable with like one form of writing. How do you encourage them to not?
Well, first and foremost, mine are banned from any sort of PowerPoint. My question to them, because again, I want it to be authentic. And so my question to them is, in what scenario are you showing a PowerPoint and who are you showing it to? So unless you can justify this PowerPoint is being showed to this people, these people, and this is why it's in PowerPoint format, then no. I say no PowerPoint's, not really interested in posters. And so the first thing I talk them through is, who is your audience? What is the best way to reach your audience? What is going to catch their attention? And so I encourage things like they can make Google sites, because maybe you want to be able just to send people to this resource and be able to send it to a wide variety of people. But sometimes I'll have kids will be like, oh, I want to make a poster about this thing that's happening in some other country. And I'm like, where are you putting this poster? In the halls here at Raytown South? How is that reaching your audience? What are you wanting them to do? And so we just have a lot of conversation about audience and purpose and what is the best product to create to do that. Now, I encourage them to do things like, you can do a podcast, you can do a YouTube video, you could make it like a newscast. I even let, of course, we have debate and forensics. So I even say you could do a forensics performance. You can write an opinion piece that you could put into a newspaper. And so I try and provide a lot of, I do allow them to write. If they do the video stuff, I do require them to do a transcript along with it. Like, I want to see in writing what it is you're saying. But then yes, you can record it, you can perform it. Yeah. Any other questions about that?
I love that, Sarah. Thanks for those amazing ideas.
All right, so then I think that kind of brings us to a close here for the most part. Just kind of reflecting on all the things we talked about today. I would be interested in hearing your key takeaways from the session, any challenges or questions that still remain for you. You can share them in the chat. You can share out loud. I think you could reflect silently if that's what you need to do, but kind of taking a moment before we jump back into our busy days and forget that this even happened, to maybe set an intention for, what did I get out of this? What would I want to use it for? How could I apply it? And maybe an action plan, I guess you would say.
Yeah, I just want to jump in. Hopefully everybody's been following along in chat, but I really appreciate the fact that you've shared a couple of the books that you've been pulling from, and also the websites of the handout, and then just the comments that have been popping up. So if you haven't yet checked out chat, everybody, be sure and do that. One thing that I keep thinking about too, Sarah, another example that kind of ties into a couple of the C's that you were sharing. One of our faculty members in special education was sharing that she creates visual abstracts. And so I started that this last week with my students to think about, okay, you've got your regular abstract that you're writing for this. It's going to be a research day in December. And that is for a disciplinary audience. So they're pretty complex, pretty technical things. But how can you take the ideas in that and create it to a more general audience, but take it even another step further? And that is, she calls these both visual, but also key abstracts. And it's where you have to be able to take and bring all this down to just, what are the really key important points? But she came about this when she would listen to a speaker herself, that for her own comprehension and staying engaged, she would always keep a notepad and just start jotting these visuals and these key words, and then showing how they relate and create a visual. And then she'd snap a picture of it and send it to the speaker, thanking them for the session. So she's now become known for this. It's Jessica Rodriguez. But I think it's so fascinating because not only is she finding that her own strategy, but it's something now she's teaching students. And not only is a listening learning strategy, but also a reading comprehension strategy, because I'm thinking you could do this reading, complex text as well. So anyway, you just got me thinking with all these many connections that we have in our classes of how to build in that storytelling, focusing, sharing component. Thank you.
That's really cool that she does that. That sounds really neat. On a very minor, like I do, just as we start our day with writing my exit ticket, a lot of times it's occasionally a specific question about the content, but more often than not, I'll throw out, summarize what you learned today in 1 sentence, summarize what you learned today in 3 sentences, summarize what you learned today in a model. And so trying to force them to interact with that information in various ways. How do you condense it to 1 sentence? How do you stretch it to 5? And I think that even those sorts of things, when you specify how many sentences, can force them to interact with writing in a new way.
Any advice, Sarah, for helping you get to know your students' culture better? I know you've got a smaller group than some of us get.
Yeah, honestly, just that to me actually is the beauty of the writing.
Mhm.
Because, for example, last year I had kids write a poem in microbiology. I shared, there is this guy who's a kickboxer, and he went to Malaysia to do professional kickboxing, learned about malaria, became inspired, and wrote an entire book of poetry. And the way he would write his poems, he had these huge, amazing poems. Like, and I rate the poem I share with them is called Silence Anopheles, and the entire thing is written from the perspective of the Anopheles mosquito. And it actually creates in you some empathy for this mosquito that's just doing its thing. You know, it's not trying to hurt anybody. And so it's this poem, and then he ends it with like a specific fact, and then a citation, again, going to that source, a citation of where he got that fact. And so the entire poem was inspired by this fact. And then I give my students a similar assignment. It doesn't have to be as long as his, but I want you to find a fact, write a poem, quote the fact, include a citation. And when I gave that assignment, one of my students actually wrote a lot about his experiences during COVID, things that were going on for him during COVID, that he wove into this poem. And so it's not going to happen with 100% of kids, but it's amazing when you ask kids to write and ask them to make connections to real life, what they're willing to write down that they're not willing to say out loud. And so I can learn a lot more from my kids through having them write than I can through asking them to contribute in class, because a lot of them are just quiet and self-conscious and they don't want to share it in front of the entire class, but they'll write it down to me, or they'll write it on the assignment knowing that I'll see it. And so really it is through writing that I feel like I learn the most about my students.
I can't
Anything?
think of a better way to end that.
No, I felt like we kind of stuck the landing, you know?
Very nice. Any other questions for Sarah? Perfectly timed.
Yeah.
Well done. Thank you for joining us. And feel free to stick around if you want to chat with Sarah anymore. But
Thanks for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah.
Mhm.
This is so great, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Yep.
definitely very much enjoyed it. I have lots more ideas. My students always, when you tell them we're going to write today, it's always like, ugh.
Well, part of what I'm trying to do with my kids is just build stamina. And it honestly, and I'm sure you are all seeing the effects of it, it gets worse every year.
Yeah.
I think it's just growing up in a different world, a much more digital world.
Sure.
That a lot of what I'm trying to do with all the writing is just write to try and build that stamina so that they get more used to doing it. Yeah.
I love that. They probably don't expect it when they come to biology or microbiology.
If I had $1 for every time I've heard, isn't this science class? Why are we doing art? Why are we doing reading? Why are we doing writing? And I always explain, well, the real world does not have walls, does not, fit in boxes. In the real world, we're doing all these things at the same time, talking about how much scientists have to read and write, all of the illustrations that go into science. I mean, even just sticking to the science, you can connect it to all those things. So.
It makes me feel so much better, Sarah. Joe Barnett, who I know you know, right?
Mhm.
And Melanie Femmler are going to do the DESI Science for November. It's like November 7th or something.
Mhm.
And they're leaning hard into creative writing. And I'm like, how is this going to go with science teachers? But they are like passionate about it. They want to do it. So I'm just finding citations to like support it. So if you have any good books on, besides the two you already shared, on creativity in the science classroom,
Okay.
I just need to throw some citations in there. I would greatly appreciate that. And also when you're ready to do DESI Science again, let me know. It's in person in Columbia now.
Okay.
So that is the only challenge. I know you have to drive a little ways, but you're always welcome. I just don't want to lean on you too hard because you have 8 million things you're doing.
Yeah. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And, you know, one other piece though on, you know, Sarah, when you were talking about the writing